The X100F is part of a venerable series of cameras which has, well, become an iconic staple in the Fuji lineup. It's basically a shrunken down version of an X Pro 2. It has exactly the same sensor in it. It's got a very compact little pancake 23mm f2 lens, and it's expensive. So let's see exactly whether or not it's worth it, who it's aimed at, and what its pros and cons are. So let's get the first thing out of the way and talk about the styling of this little camera. Obviously it's got a very retro design, and we've seen cameras over the years do that, well, in a variety of ways, from really well to really badly. I'm not mentioning any names, Nikon, with your DF, but that was a big clunky mess of a camera and none of it really worked properly. It sacrificed function in the to pursue the god of form, whereas this camera is very much the other way around. Everything is exactly where you want it to be. You can look down and see exactly what settings you are just by looking at the dials on everything. You can see what aperture you're at, what shutter speed and what ISO, just from looking at the dials on the top of the camera. And yet it has got this sort of retro feel. A lot of people, when you are using this in town, are surprised to see that it has got a digital screen on the back. It does genuinely look like an old film camera. It might be something like a Leica if you didn't look at it too closely, and some people in a derogatory manner have called it the poor man's Leica, but, well, let's be honest, you're not that poor if you're buying one of these, because they are still north of £1,000. But the question is it worth that £1,000? Let's see. The first thing that you've got to consider in 2018 about whether even buying a camera like this makes sense is not even other cameras. The main challenge to a point and shoot camera with a fixed lens like this is, of course, a phone that you'd already have in your pocket. And so this is going to be aimed at somebody who's dedicated enough about photography to want to be able to control the settings of their picture in a way that you can't get from just using an iPhone. Now, the iPhones these days themselves are running about £1,000, and of course you can also scroll on Facebook on that and do your Snapchats or whatever, and this one can't. So it is still a dedicated camera. It's a standalone device that does require you to put a huge amount of extra investment into it. Now, with smartphone cameras, you're not anymore penalised with the image quality, except in maybe very low light situations. But the one thing that you can never replace is the physical and tactile nature of having a camera with dedicated buttons on it in order to change your settings. That's where this really comes into its own, and it does make you feel like you're using a proper camera. It is kind of old school these days, but at the same time as that, that is why people are going to buy it. Talked about the 23mm focal length in terms of Fuji cameras in a previous video, which I'll link on the screen here. It is perfect. If you're only going to have the one lens to travel around with, then this is about right for more or less everything. Unless you're doing a lot of portrait work or wildlife work, this is a terrific choice from Fuji if you're not going to be able to change the lenses. The camera has got the same sensor inside it as my X-T2s. It's also the same sensor that you get in the X Pro 2 as well. It's a 24 megapixel sensor with the X-Trans 3 engine driving it all, and so it's got all of the exact same image quality that you do get with those cameras. It's part of the reason I picked it up, is so that I could transition from using the small camera to the big camera, know that I was going to get exactly the same image quality from each one. But they're not the same cameras, and the X-T2 does have a far superior focusing system to this one. This definitely feels like a generation behind. It doesn't have that ability to snap onto anything, and it reminded me of the Fuji cameras of old, where you weren't exactly sure that you were going to get the thing in focus or not. You had to hunt around a few times. Certainly that was the case with the X-T1s, more so with the X Pro 1, and it is still the case with this. There is a manual focus override on this little lens there, so you can actually use the dial, and it's surprisingly easy to use, even though it is a pretty thin lens and you would imagine it'd be hard to get your fingers around. I don't find that to be a problem, but with any of these systems that are fly-by-wire and use electronics and servos to move the focus of the motor as opposed to an old-school mechanical manual focusing lens, you will find that there is a slight delay in the reaction between when you turn the dial and when the focusing starts to happen, and that is something you do have to get used to. You're not going to be as snappy with this as you would with something like an X-T2 or X Pro 2 with a dedicated manual lens on it. Dynamic range is definitely something you're going to be impressed with this camera. It's tests I've been able to do to extract about 4 stops reliably from the shadows before they start to fall apart, and even a stop at best out of the highlights, which is absolutely tremendous for a digital sensor. The ability to get these things, of course, only exists if you're shooting in RAW, and although everybody really talks about Fuji in terms of the JPEG performance, I would recommend shooting in RAW plus JPEG, because there are always going to be those occasions when you do need to get the detail out of different parts of your picture, and it does give you that extra ability when you get back into Lightroom or whatever piece of editing software you're using later. Another absolutely terrific thing about this camera is the leaf shutter. It's very, very quiet, and it's absolutely tremendous if you need to shoot in places where you need to be a little bit quiet or a little bit stealthy. For that reason, I really like shooting it at weddings where you have to be quiet in a church. It's also good when you're traveling and you want to get involved with the people around you, but you don't want to be sort of, you know, it's disrupting what's going on. So it might be that something like a ceremony going on, or some event where, you know, being quiet is important. You don't want to be disrespectful to the people around you. You want to quietly be able to take some shots. So the leaf shutter on that is absolutely tremendous. And the other thing is that it does give you sync speed up to 0.002 of a second, which is tremendous if you want to do stuff with flash in the midday sun, for example, and you can even open up, you know, to get a nice bokeh, nice blurry background, still be able to get some fill light in the front. The bokeh on this is really nicely controlled too. It's kind of soft and smooth and actually really quite impressive. Overall, the build quality of this camera is tremendous. It's a full metal body. Everything feels really good on there. All the little dials and the switches and everything are all metal too, and the buttons have a nice crisp feel to them. That's partly, of course, because it doesn't have any weather sealing in it. The cameras with the weather seal buttons do definitely have a more spongy feel to them. Bear in mind, that is a really important thing, that, you know, you won't be able to take that out in the rain quite as much as you can with the XT series. You know, that's just one of the payoffs that you have to have for using this line of cameras. I would actually really like them because it is such a good sort of everyday camera to travel around with. I would love it if the next edition of this did have weather sealing in it. So it's crunch time then. Is the price point of this camera, which is an expensive camera, worth it? Well, I have to say that if you're talking with your head, then the answer is no. The simple fact is that point and shoot cameras with fixed lenses are going obsolete. Whether we like it or not, the smartphone is here to stay. The technology is getting better all the time, and the reality is that, yes, although you can get slightly better image quality with something like an X100F than you could get with the latest generation of smartphone sensors, that gap is closing all the time, and for most people it's an indistinguishable gap, particularly if you're just shooting and putting stuff up on social media. That being said, if you are a dedicated photographer and you want a camera that's got proper buttons on it, that feels like an old school film camera, which is all metal bodies in construction, that you can look down at a glance and see what your camera settings are on proper old school mechanical dials, then this is really the best option that you can use for that. And so from a heart point of view, I love this. Every time I use this camera, I love it. I love picking it up. It puts a smile on my face. It's one of the most tactile and satisfying cameras that I've ever used. And so I was happy to put my money down for this and buy it. And I think if you are, you know, dedicated to photography, then you would be just as happy as I am with this particular camera. But I don't know how many more generations of these we're going to get. These things, they feel like an anomaly. They feel like part of a generation that's passed as technologies come along and usurp them. I still enjoy it though, and I think you will too. So if you are absolutely dedicated to photography, you will certainly love this little camera.